Hello, students. I'm going to talk about Chapter 9 today. Chapter 9 is about survey research. Something else that I like and like to talk a lot about. So, let me talk to you guys a little bit about survey research. There are two questions I want to discuss today. Question number one is about survey mode selection. So, let's say, for example, you need to survey 50 criminal justice practitioners about their attitudes towards evidence-based practices. Compare the strengths and the weaknesses of A, online surveys, and B, telephone interviews for this project. Which would you choose and why would you choose that? Number two, bias mitigation. Identify and explain three different types of bias that can affect survey research from those discussed in the previous chapter. For each, propose specific strategies to minimize its impact in a study of public perceptions of police legitimacy. So let's begin. Let's talk about question number one first. You need to survey 50 criminal justice practitioners about their attitudes towards evidence-based practices. Comparing the strengths and weaknesses of A, online surveys, and B, telephone interviews for the project. Which one would you choose? Why would you choose that? Discuss that. So let's talk about that. Now, both online surveys and phone interviews are effective ways to find out how 50 criminal justice professionals feel about evidence-based practices. But they differ greatly in terms of cost, the quality, the data quality, the response rate, the practicality issues. It's all very difficult sometimes, online versus face-to-face or telephone interviews. Telephone interviews, actually, to be honest with you guys, and you should know this, have become much more harder for researchers to do, actually. And the reason is because so many people now have cell phones whose numbers are not listed. So it actually becomes much harder for a researcher to be able to get data. You could used to be back in the day, especially when I was in school in 05 and 06, you could just buy from data collection companies, or phone companies. You could just buy the phone numbers and make phone calls. Now, the other problem, of course, is that even if someone gets a hold of your cell phone number, I think most students know about this. If you see an unknown number pop up on your phone, you're probably not going to answer it, or it may go to spam mail, right, to your spam box, because some of us, like myself included, we have very tight security because there's so many scammers out there, and other people put up their phone numbers in the Do Not Call national database list. So it becomes very difficult as a researcher to be able to assess and find out these phone numbers. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean you shouldn't try, of course. And to answer the question fully, so they do have effective ways to find out, but they also differ a lot in terms of cost, data quality, response rate, practicality. Now, online surveys have a lot of advantages. For busy people like myself and other researchers, like maybe some students watching this video, police officers, probation officers, lawyers, other types of people working in the criminal justice system, for example, and they want to talk to criminal justice practitioners, their cost effectiveness, speed of distribution, ability for respondents to complete them at their convenience is very crucial. And I'm sure many students have probably gotten those type of online surveys through SurveyMonkey or through other types of survey databases where they just have to click through and they can just, go ahead and answer the question very quickly. You all know, you even get surveys from restaurants from a scale to 1 to 5. How much did you really enjoy that Whopper? Please be honest with us. So it's everywhere now. That's just how it is. Now, online tools also make it very simple to gather and arrange data automatically, which minimizes then human error and speeds up the analysis. Furthermore, the anonymity of these online surveys can promote more truthful answers, particularly when inquiring about attitudes or possible oppositions. So you could easily find a way to do these type of surveys very quickly, very anonymously, in a neutral fashion. Now, of course, there are drawbacks to online surveys. There are low response rates because I'm sure many students get these messages from SurveyMonkey and other online data collection companies and survey companies, and they're like, yeah, I'm not gonna respond to that. I'll get around to it whenever I get around to it. Let it sit in my junk box. I don't really care. That happens many times. You'd be surprised by how many times that can happen for people. I myself am guilty of that. I'll get emails sometimes from survey companies, and I'm like, yeah, I'm not, I don't have the energy right now. Now, of course, there are low response rates, right? There's little control over who completes a survey. Sometimes you really don't know who completes a survey. I could tell if I had a secretary or an administrative assistant. I could say, hey, can you just fill this out for me and forward it over to you? I don't have time to do this right now. It'll enter you in a drawing for a $50 Amazon gift card, maybe. Um, but also respondents could misunderstand the questions, right? If they're not given a chance to clarify them. Lastly, the responses often lack the specificity, which restricts the depth of understanding of the actual survey. So basically, your whole survey might not be worth it then, because you didn't follow the process properly to ask the right questions. Remember, the most important thing a researcher should think about when they're designing a research survey is how the question is worded. How the question is worded determines everything. That's why words are so critical. They're so critical. I know students probably hate me saying stuff like that because, maybe Mr. AI or ChatGPT, or Mr. Claude, they can put stuff together. But the words are so critical. How you frame the words and put them together. And they build on each other. Words, like they say, letters become words. Words become sentences. Sentences become entire paragraphs. And those paragraphs mean something. But it all starts with those letters and those words, how they're organized. So how a question is worded in an online survey and maybe on the phone when you're talking to somebody, and you can say, can you rephrase that? Can you explain to me more what you're asking about? That is something that you cannot do in an online survey. That's hard to do. It's impossible to do, actually, right? So conversely, then telephone interviews are actually much richer. They're more complex. They're more information you can gather. As they say, there's something that Professor Bob Ben, who was at Harvard, I don't know if he's still alive or not, but years ago, he wrote an article about data gathering. And he said there's something called DRIP. And DRIP is an acronym. DRIP acronym stands for data rich, but information poor. Data rich, but information poor. So what that means is that you could have great data, but if you don't know how to, squeeze and manipulate the data properly, you can't get good information. You get crappy information, to put it mildly. You get junk information. You don't want that. As a researcher, you want good data that leads to good information, and it leads all the way back to what the question is, how the question is worded. So that's why I always tell students, be really careful how you word anything. Your emails, your text messages, even if you post something on Facebook. Because people, unfortunately, will manipulate stuff, or they'll interpret it in their head. So that's a big problem. Now, interviews then have the ability to elucidate questions. They can ask questions, they can delve deeper in answers, they can make sure participants comprehend the questions properly. Some of you may have been in focus groups. Focus groups is also a big deal for many students. They do focus groups and all, where I myself have been a participant in some focus groups. And the focus groups are easy in that sense. You get sort of like group norms and group understanding of something. So oftentimes people are also sometimes shy to ask questions. Because of the direct interaction, this approach has frequently produced high quality data and can increase response rates. Since the tone and elaboration offer a lot more context, it is therefore much more helpful when examining attitudes on a telephone call. The main drawbacks, of course, of telephone interviews are financial and logistical. It's hard. It's time consuming. It's extremely much more time consuming. Think about it. You can't call somebody at midnight, but you could definitely send out a survey question at midnight. That's not a big deal. But you really can't call someone after 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock, right? There's like a show I used to watch called Curb Your Enthusiasm. Some students may know about it. It's on HBO. Curb Your Enthusiasm, there was a cutoff. There was one episode where the guy had to make phone calls. He didn't want to have he thought the cutoff time was 9 o'clock. And when he calls some friend's house, they're like, no. The cutoff time for our house is 8:30. You can't call after 8:30. That's it. You want these kind of things, you got to call in the morning time or in the middle of the day. So there's cutoff times actually, right? But with online, it's not really cutoff, right? So that's the easier one. Then you, of course, if you're speaking with someone directly, they might be less forthright sometimes. Sometimes people are actually not comfortable talking face to face. They feel better comfortable talking online or like a chat box, right? So they're discussing subjects that could affect their professional practices. They could be considered biased or prejudiced. They're going to be very sensitive about that. So they may not want that information put out there, right? Now, if you were to do something like this, the 50 practitioners, you should probably look at a mixed methods type of project. I would send out an online survey to all 50 practitioners and then do a follow-up telephone interview if you can. So it's mixed methods. Now, of course, I have done mixed methods before, so I can talk about this. I did qualitative interviews with my prisoner reentry program. I also did quantitative survey analysis data, where they would fill out survey. And I noticed that when I did the qualitative interviews and I did the quantitative survey, there was a lot of data I gathered, a lot of rich data that mined into very rich information that I proved especially useful for my dissertation. In fact, I published at least 6 articles from just one dissertation, mainly because I was able to use a mixed methods approach. So that's why it's always helpful to have mixed methods. I would advise students many times, don't go for just one type of methodology. Try to use mixed methods if you can. You'll get much more better and richer data. Now, if you were to choose just one as a student, my approach would be, I would tell you to go for the online surveys, because as a student that may be better for you to do and get done with. Telephone calls may be much harder to do. Focus groups are much harder to do also. But as a student, online surveys are probably much easier in that sense. Now, let's talk about bias mitigation. I want to talk about bias mitigation. So the question was, identify and explain 3 different types of bias that can affect survey research. For each, then propose specific strategies to minimize its impact in a study of public perceptions of police legitimacy. Now, there are 3 different types of bias that can affect survey research, including recall bias, sampling bias, and social desirability bias. Recall bias occurs when a respondent has a different motivation than during a survey, or when they cannot recall their motivation or reasoning for originally responding to the survey. A strategy to minimize the impact of recall bias in a study of public perceptions of police legitimacy is to minimize the time gap between the original and the follow-up surveys. This will help reduce the risk that participants will forget their reasoning for selecting their answers. Another strategy could be to use memory types of aids, to help participants recall the circumstances surrounding their first time answering the survey or interviewing. Now, an example of sampling bias is when conducting a telephone survey. So, for example, the researcher will then call random phone numbers from publicly listed directories to get a response. And there's lots of them out there. But the problem, of course, happens that many times those are work-related phone numbers. People are at work, they're not going to really want to talk to you while they're at work. This will then, of course, exclude certain members of the population, such as those whose phone numbers are unlisted from public registries, which a lot of people have done, right? In fact, many people don't even have landlines anymore. I myself don't have a landline. I only have a cell phone. So for older people, they like having a landline. But, for younger, certain generation, I'm Generation X, we really don't need a landline. I mean, a lot of people have given it up. So those numbers are not listed anymore, especially cell phone numbers. It becomes much harder that way, right? Something which I discussed previously. In addition, the researcher will then have to get a surplus of responses from those who have a landline and are typically home during business hours, such as a person who's retired or a disabled person, or maybe someone who works from home. But again, they're working from home, right? They're not going to be willing to really talk to you. Now, a strategy that can help decrease sampling bias when conducting a study is to use targeted sampling frames. That will ensure that the contact lists are accurate and up to date, and will expand the sample population to include those with cell phones or who may be part of the working class. See, because what's going to happen, unfortunately, is you're going to get a very biased sample of people if you're calling landline phone numbers, and it's mostly retired people, so they're elderly, mainly, or they're disabled people. So their worldview will be very skewed in that sense. You'll get a lot of restrictions on that sampling process. Now, of course, social desirability bias is the tendency for research participants to answer questions in ways that then project themselves in a positive light to gain favor with family and friends, or to align with social norms, rather than providing answers that are true to themselves and their core beliefs. This type of bias can then undermine the validity of survey data, especially in questionnaires. A strategy to minimize the impact of social desirability bias would be to conduct an interview rather than a questionnaire. This is because in an interview, the researcher may then spot inconsistent answers in a respondent's body language or tone and ask further probing questions to get to the heart of those findings, those true feelings, which it's hard to do online, right? Additionally, then interviewers can then use a third-party technique, which asks questions about what they think others would do in a particular scenario to kind of discern their individual perspective and to try to mitigate any bias or prejudice or hesitation in answering the question. So those are all things to consider if you're considering bias mitigation and to remove that. So I hope that that was something that was quite useful to all of you. And I will definitely looking forward to seeing you guys in the next chapter, which will be chapter 10 on experimental research. Thank you again for chapter 9, spending time with me on survey research.